Okay, so today we're going to talk about Russia and World War One. We've talked about Latin America. We've talked about all the places that the U.S. is involved in. So all the imperialist sort of things that are going on in the world at this time with the U.S. And then we're going to deal with sort of today what's going on in Russia, why that matters for the U.S., how World War One started, and then what finally got us into the war as well. So we're just hitting questions 3 and 5 and 17 and through 19 in Unit 6. So first off, so what's going on in Russia? Why does that matter? So the thing that's going on there is called the Bolshevik Revolution. So number 20 is the Bolshevik Revolution. So what happened? So this was where, so at this time there was an anti-communist government. So they were not communists in control of Russia at this time. But the communists began to sort of fight for their right over the government. So Russia at this time is involved in World War One. There's a lot of poverty though in World War One because wars take a lot of money from countries. They make people live lives a lot more difficult. People are having trouble like feeding their families, just generally fighting off poverty at every turn. And that's where the communists come in at this time. So they're offering this sort of different plan, saying we can get you out of this stuff. They ran on this sort of quote of we want land, peace, and bread. So sort of fighting for sort of taking back the land that is rightfully ours, peace, so getting out of World War One, and then bread, being able to feed your family, being able not to starve to death. So what happened? So this was basically a civil war in Russia, fighting over who was going to control the government between the communists and the anti-communists. So what happens? The communists do win. So this is where the individuals like Vladimir Lenin sort of become famous in world history. This is where they emerge on the scene. So the communists do take control over Russia. It becomes a communist nation, and this is where you see the development of the USSR. So the Soviet Union begins to emerge. So the reaction. What does this matter to the U.S. at this time? So for U.S. history, why does this matter? So this really strains the relationship between the U.S. and Russia slash USSR because communism is not a very well liked thing, a very well liked ideology in America. It's not seen as compatible with democracy, seen as sort of counterintuitive. So it's not. It goes completely against everything we stand for in a lot of people's minds. So the U.S. actually tries to help the anti-communists, so the current government in Russia win, but the communists do triumph. They are sort of taken over. The communists do take control over Russia, and what happens then is there's a lot of sort of paranoia hitting the U.S. at this time, and this leads to the very first Red Scare. So when you hear the term red when it's like in front of a term like with history, generally it's referring to some type of communist action. So if you hear red countries, it's generally communist countries. It's just the color associated with communism. So Red Scare, what this is it's basically this huge degree of paranoia in the U.S. concerning communism, concerning like people are scared it might happen here in the U.S., all kinds of things like that. So they're starting to seek out foreigners, be really suspicious of individuals who may sort of be either linked to Russia, linked to communism sometime, anything like that. That anybody that scares you, anybody that seems suspicious is sort of linked to this sort of communism. It's like the thing that everybody blames for everything. Also, what we've been talking about with Unit 4 and 5 are labor unions. So labor unions sort of reached a new level before World War One. They're starting to come on the stage, fight for workers' rights. The problem is, though, it's a little scary when you're hearing all these communist revolutions going on in Russia when you have workers sort of uniting and fighting against sort of the man fighting for their rights. It's frightening to a lot of people because there's like a parallel there where people are uniting and going against sort of common logic against people in control at that time. So this is where you see a lot of anti-union feelings coming out. So people are fighting against unions at this time. They're not seen as a positive thing anymore because the Bolshevik Revolution, communism, is emerging and it's starting to resemble some of the things that labor does to negotiate better conditions. And what you also see, so the last thing there is the Palmer raids. So all of this stuff is for 21, how it affects. So all these things are for how like it affects the U.S. So the Palmer raids eventually start, which we're going to talk about later. But it's basically arresting foreigners, people who may be slightly suspicious, people who people may suspect or is doing something communist related. Maybe they're Russian, all these different reasons, and they're basically held and captured without cause. A lot of people were sort of beaten up during this time period, but it's a very unlawful seizure. It's sort of being captured for no really good reason other than just suspicion. But we'll talk about those more later. So looking at those pictures to the right there, I know it's hard to see the top one. So the foot sort of going down the steps there, it has labor on the legs, so it's talking about workers this time. So we're talking about individuals like Eugene Debs, all these riots and things going on at this time. So it's saying the first step is strikes and walkouts. So you can sort of see that on the first step. So that's like the first step towards problems. And then you have the next step is disorder and riots. So we're talking about Haymarket Square, we're talking about the Pullman strike, so people uniting and really causing trouble. The next step that this artist is saying is Bolshevism, so this communist idealism, this ability to sort of unite and go against the government. And then the next step is chaos. So it's sort of making people scared of labor unions, making people scared of uniting and fighting under this idea of unions, of uniting labor. So it's really putting the idea that maybe labor unions are just the first step until we get to something like what happened in Russia. The bottom picture there is what it says on the guy. I know it's hard to see, but the guy behind the Statue of Liberty there, it says European anarchist, and in his hand he's got a bomb, and in the other hand he's got a dagger. So it's this idea of he's sneaking up behind Lady Liberty, he's going to hurt us, he's going to really put us in danger, try to kill everything that Lady Liberty, that the U.S. stand for. So also putting the fear that maybe foreigners are possibly a suspicious group of people at this time. So next, so World War I begins. So we talked about this a little bit already, but so World War I starting, but without the U.S. involved. So that's the one big thing to remember is the U.S. is not involved when World War I begins. So what started it though? So for number 22, just for your own personal knowledge and to answer the question in the packet. So what started World War I? So the thing to remember here is tensions are already very tight, very on the rise in Europe and across that sort of part of the world. A lot of countries don't get along. There's a lot of sort of alliances brewing. People are starting to sort of team up and be like, if something happens, you're going to come with me, right? Everybody's trying to get sort of friends to fight with them. So there's everything. The conflict's already been brewing. It's a long process that got to this point. But the thing that really is pointed to as like the turning point, what really started the war, was there on the second bullet, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. So this is a leader in Austria, and he was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. And what this does is basically is a snowball effect. So Austria is upset; they want to go after Serbia. Serbia's got allies, so they sort of team up with their allies. Austria-Hungary teams up with their allies, and it just starts this sort of snowball effect where eventually a war is started at what and eventually is called the Great War or World War I. So U.S. reaction. So this is the World War I started. What does the U.S. think about this? So the first response at this time by our president, who was Woodrow Wilson. So his response, so for number 23, is neutrality. So the public didn't want to be involved, and Wilson was more than happy to say, nope, we're not getting involved. It's not our fight. It has nothing to do with us. We're going to stay out. Because in 1916, so for number 25 here, he ran on the campaign slogan of, he kept us out of war. So it seems to be pretty important because he got reelected. So the public likes the idea of keeping us out of war. So for number 25, he kept us out of war. So that's how, one of the reasons he helped win the election, that was sort of his slogan. And this is actually one of his campaign vehicles that would drive around with all his messages. And you see the second one there on the list on the truck. It says, who keeps us out of war. So he's sort of asking who did this, and it's Wilson. So it's a big sort of truck promoting Wilson for president. So going back, but the U.S. does eventually get involved, as you should know. So the U.S. does jump in eventually. Why? So it's sort of shown in that cartoon there. So you have, but we'll talk about it for number 24. So it's called the Zimmerman Note. So it's in 1917, a telegram was intercepted from Germany to Mexico. So Germany was sending a letter to Mexico, and what they wanted Mexico to do was to declare war on the U.S., so start fighting the U.S., and this would keep the U.S. out of World War I. So their idea was, hey, if we can get them involved with Mexico, then maybe they'll stay out of World War I and we can win the war. So the idea was this was going to help Germany and their allies win the war and also stop any flows of arms. So guns going over overseas to the allies in Europe. So sort of getting the U.S. completely out of the war and keeping them sort of held up with Mexico. The other thing to remember here, so jumping on that, was Germany was also getting ready to start unrestricted sub-warfare. So they were really going to start targeting any kind of ships coming across the ocean, and this was really going to tick off the U.S. So if they got the U.S. involved with Mexico, like they're more upset with Mexico than Germany, then maybe they wouldn't come join. But you'll see eventually that the U.S. intercepts this. They eventually are very upset about sort of U-boats sinking merchant ships, and they do get involved. So the last thing before we go is looking at that picture. It's obviously a German, so every time you see the hat like that, it's generally referring to a German individual. So he's sort of whispering in the Mexican individuals who has this very typical sombrero. So these are trying to be very obvious pictures of who is talking to who here. And it says, join with Germany and you get a bit of the United States. So part of the thing Germany promised was to get that land back that the U.S. Obtained through the Mexican-American War. So that's how sort of the first trigger for U.S. entrance, and that is where we will leave it for today.